Twice a year, my wife and I take our RV into the San Juan Mountains in southwest Colorado. We usually make one summer trip and one winter trip. My wife loves the snow. But last year was different. The snow started and just didn't stop. For 4 straight days, it fell without a break. By day 5, avalanches were coming down all around us. A massive avalanche the previous winter had already cleared huge sections of trees, and wildfires had burned through other areas we usually camp in during the summer. With nothing left to hold the snow, the slopes gave way, and the bare ground turned into rivers of snow and ice. The route to the nearest town was blocked off. We had one alternate way out, but it was a much longer route, and it seemed like only a matter of time before that would be snowed over too. We decided to get the hell out of there while we still could. We packed our gear quickly, trying to work between the heavy snowfall. As we loaded the last of our things, we heard it, the sound of yet another distant avalanche. By then we had become used to the noise, but this time, it was different. We worried it had blocked our last escape route. If that happened, we'd be stranded for who knows how long, with only 2 days' worth of food left in the RV. We ran to check where the snow had shifted. Relief washed over us when we saw that our route was still clear. But just seconds later, we heard a scream. It was the most blood-curdling, bone-chilling scream I had ever heard in my life, piercing, desperate, and full of terror. It echoed across the valley, sharp and long, before suddenly cutting off. There was no doubt in my mind that someone had just died. My wife and I stood frozen in place, listening to the silence that followed. We knew we had to do something. We just didn't know what. The snow has a way of distorting sound, making it impossible to tell how close or far something really is. We had no way of knowing exactly where the scream had come from. In the end, we ran out into the snow, searching for someone, anyone, who could help. Luckily, we found a person nearby with an ATV and a radio. They used it to call for help. Beyond that, there wasn't much we could do. The avalanche risk was too high to go searching any further ourselves. Once we knew a rescue team was on the way, we realized we were more likely to get in the way than actually help. We made the difficult decision to leave. The ride home was eerily silent. As we drove east on I-70, we saw more devastation. Avalanches had hit the area hard. Driving through Glenwood Canyon, we missed another massive slide by maybe 40 to 45 minutes. That one was so strong it changed the course of the Colorado River and washed away entire sections of the highway. The destruction was unbelievable. Entire roads swallowed by snow and debris. The landscape was unrecognizable, as if the world itself had ended. That trip taught me something about Mother Nature. She is a giver, but she knows how to take away just as easily. She showed us her true power in ways I had never seen before. The relentless snow, the unstoppable avalanches, the sheer destruction. It was enough to humble any man, to remind him how small and insignificant he really is. We were lucky to escape when we did. But I can't forget that scream. It still plays in my head sometimes. A reminder of how powerless we are against the force of nature, and how quickly everything can change. I used to do a lot of solo survival stuff during the winter, and this is the story of my final trip before I decided it wasn't such a good idea anymore. It was midwinter. The ground was almost frozen solid, with a slight dusting of snow. It was cold, but a dry kind of cold, which from experience is the best you can ask for. I'd been walking through the woods for hours, armed with my shotgun, looking for birds, but not having any luck. After another hour of walking, the trees thinned out, and I came across a valley. It wasn't part of the plan, but it looked like a decent enough shortcut, a narrow trail cutting through a ravine, leading to another clearing on the other side. The day was getting late, and I didn't want to waste time circling around. The slope down looked steep but manageable. So I figured, why the hell not? I started down, my boots crunching in the frost, but making my way down without slipping was much slower than I expected. The longer I took, the darker it got. As the walls of the ravine rose up on either side, and the trees and shadows closed in, I felt the cold sinking into my bones. But it wasn't just the cold giving me a chill. Something about this place felt wrong. And that's when I saw him. He was standing still as a statue in the middle of the trail, maybe 50 yards ahead of me. He held some kind of civilian AR in his hands, at the ready, like he was waiting for something. When I saw him, I froze. He didn't look like any kind of camper or hiker I'd ever seen. His clothes were filthy, layers of mismatched jackets and pants barely hanging on his skinny frame. He was gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in days, and his eyes, sunken, dark, locked onto me in a way that made my stomach twist into a knot. At that moment, I couldn't move. My brain was screaming at me to turn around and run, but my legs wouldn't listen. My shotgun was slung over my shoulder, and I could feel it slipping. The thought of it falling filled me with a dread I'd never felt before. If that happened, he might think I was trying to aim at him. He might be skittish enough to open fire before realizing I was just some dumb idiot with a loose strap. Slowly, I adjusted the strap of my shotgun, careful to make my movements deliberate and non-threatening. The man didn't move. The air felt heavy, almost pressing down on me. I wanted to say something, anything, but my mouth felt locked up. I forced myself to take a step back, then another. Watching him, watching me. I didn't run. I knew that'd be a bad idea. Every step I took was slow, deliberate. The crunch of my boots in the snow sounded almost too loud. The man didn't follow, but he made his presence felt. Even after the trail curved, and I could no longer see him, I could still feel his eyes on me. When I finally made it out of the valley, the cold seemed to lift, and the world felt normal again. I didn't stop moving until I was far enough away to feel safe. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me, watching from the trees. That night, sitting by the fire, I kept replaying it in my head. Deer season wasn't open. AR-15s aren't legal for hunting around here, and he didn't look like a hunter. Hell, he didn't even look like he belonged out there at all. He seemed more like a man who hadn't been part of the world in a long time. Such a long time that something else had taken his place. The next morning, I drove into town and reported it to the sheriff. He listened, nodded, and said they'd check it out. Weeks went by. I never heard back. I haven't gone back to that valley since. I can't shake the feeling that he wasn't hunting deer or anything else. Whoever was down there didn't want me in that valley, and I'm only too happy to oblige him. I've always enjoyed winter camping, the kind of trips that push you to your limits and force you to embrace the cold and silence of the frozen wilderness. Last winter, I decided to go on a solo trip deep into north-central Pennsylvania. The area I picked was so remote that getting there required an hour-long drive down dirt forest service roads, followed by a 6-mile hike along a barely visible trail. There wasn't a soul around, and I wasn't expecting to see anyone. The quiet, snow-covered forest was exactly what I was looking for. The trail was rough, overgrown in places, and barely recognizable. I had to push through dense, wet brush, and there were no footprints in the snow. No sign of anyone having been there recently. It felt like the kind of place only those looking to truly escape the world would find. The trail followed a creek down a rocky valley, making the hike challenging. The terrain was steep and uneven, with ice patches and thick snow covering the rocks, making each step a careful decision. But the beauty of the place, the stillness, the crisp air, was well worth the effort. I had no specific destination in mind, just wandering and hoping to find a good campsite. As the sun began to set and the temperature dropped, I came to a fork in the creek. On the other side, there was a section of relatively flat land that looked perfect for a campsite. I carefully crossed the creek, stepping cautiously on the slippery rocks, and began to explore the area. Scattered across the snow were signs that someone had been there recently. A tarp was spread out on the ground next to a stone fire ring. Nearby, a log about a foot in diameter had been chopped in half so cleanly that it had to have been done with a sharp axe or blade. A pile of gear immediately stood out: food wrappers, a small cooking set, a camping pad, and a first aid kit. Everything someone might need for a winter camping trip. But it was all just left behind, carelessly discarded, as if someone had simply walked away. As I continued looking around, my irritation at the careless abandonment of gear turned into unease when I found clothes piled by the creek. They were damp from a recent rainstorm, but not fresh, suggesting they had been left there for at least a day. A towel draped over a nearby branch was still heavy with moisture. Then, a bit further from the camp, I found something that truly disturbed me. Near the creek, an area had clearly been used as a toilet. Piles of toilet paper, some stained brown and others with remnants of urine, were scattered around. It wasn't just a few pieces, it was a whole mess of them, indicating someone had been using the spot for at least 2 to 3 weeks. But that wasn't the worst part. Hidden behind a cluster of trees was a strange metal structure, almost like a cage. It was about 4 square feet, constructed from metal bars welded together to form a crude cube-free frame. It was clearly a cage, but something didn't make sense. It had no door, no latch, nothing to indicate how it opened. It looked like someone had purposely built it out there, in the middle of nowhere. The thought sent a chill through me, one that had nothing to do with the winter air. The entire setup, from the abandoned gear to the strange cage, gave me an overwhelming sense of unease. There was just one problem. With daylight dwindling, I needed to find a spot to camp, and this was the only reasonable location nearby. I could either turn back and risk hiking out in the dark on a barely known trail, or I could stay here, next to whatever unsettling scene I had stumbled upon. In the end, I chose to stay. Even though I was fairly confident the cage builder wasn't coming back, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, every sound made my heart race. I kept my knife in hand, ready for anything. The fire flickered and cast long shadows around my camp, doing little to calm my nerves. I barely slept. Throughout the night I heard noises, distant footsteps, the sound of something moving through the snow. Too far away to see, but close enough to make my skin crawl. At the first light of dawn, I packed up as quickly as I could and hiked back to my truck, never looking back. The entire time, images of the abandoned camp, the damp clothes, and that cage haunted my thoughts. When I got home, I called the Forest Service and reported what I had found, sending them the pictures I had taken. The ranger on the phone said it was probably just a loner living off the grid, or maybe an old moonshine or pot-growing operation. But even he admitted the second option seemed unlikely for that area. I never went back. Part of me wanted to see if I could figure out what that cage was really for. But something in my gut told me that wasn't a good idea. The woods aren't always empty, and sometimes the things you find out there are better left unexplained. But that cage, it still lingers in my mind, and I don't think it ever will stop.